so we'll get started. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you today. As Gary mentioned, I have been working with him since 2014, so I wasn't sure what sort of introduction he was going to give me. So I wanted to give a brief one myself just to make sure they're all on the same page. So as Gav mentioned, I've been at Leeds Beckett since 2014, academy coach for various professional clubs for between 8 and 10 years, and most recently working in the YDP phase essentially as a scout for the FA. Currently working towards my Advanced Youth Award as well. So in terms of where I want to take this presentation over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, mainly touching on 3 different topics. So first of all, I want to talk through what are perceptual cognitive skills, why they're important for youth athletes, and essentially define some of the characteristics that allow elite athletes to be able to develop and perform at such a high level. I'm going to talk through what actually impacts perceptual cognitive skills in training and in game situations. And then finally going to finish the piece by providing some real clear practical tips for developing said perceptual cognitive skills. So in terms of a brief background to perceptual cognitive skills and the work as a whole, in the seminal work by the infamous Tom Riley in the early 2000s, when we compare truly elite and sub-elite players, tend to find that there aren't that many differences from a physical point of view. So physiologically, they're quite similar, anthropometrically, they're quite similar, and then finally, biomechanically, they're quite similar. So when we're comparing the elite and the truly elite, there's not a massive difference in these sorts of variables. From a psychosocial point of view, there begins to be a little bit more of a difference in that there begins to be elements of mental toughness and ability to work in group dynamics that begin to differentiate between elite and truly elite. But the biggest marker and that holds the biggest difference is perceptual cognitive skill. So the ability to locate, identify and process information from the environment in order to select and complete correct actions. So the work from Riley et al. Shows that at the truly elite level, the difference between athletes is the ability to perceive information in the environment to then execute an effective action. And we know that these perceptual cognitive skills these perceptual cognitive skills are made up of a range of different factors. So elite athletes are able to chunk information more effectively. They're able to recognize patterns quicker, and they're able to detect deceptive movement. But one perceptual cognitive skill I'm going to focus on, and my work's focused on over the last 5 years, has been anticipation. So the ability to predict upcoming opponent actions to allow sufficient time to respond. For me, the most important part of this definition is the second part of the statement. So it's no good being able to predict what's happening if you do it too late and don't allow the athlete appropriate time to respond in an effective manner. So we know that elite athletes are better at anticipating actions than sub-elite athletes, and they do this by a variety of different means. So first of all, they're able to better identify contextual information quicker. So that may be playing against a particular opponent, it may be playing against a particular formation. Whatever it is, elite athletes are able to contextualize information quicker and to be able to make clear and decisive actions as a result. They're also able to recognize patterns quicker. So the original work from Chase and Simon in Grandmaster chess players has been replicated in a range of sports, most recently by Jamie North, in which elite athletes are able to recognize pictures quicker, which then allows them more time to respond. And a final means in which they can anticipate action, and one in which the majority of my research is focused, is postural cue usage. So the ability of athletes to pick up subtle postural cues that are emanating from an opponent in order to predict what is about to happen. And athletes do this by being able to identify areas of the display in which to fixate their vision on. So elite athletes are able to identify where to look and, more importantly, when. So a nice paper which has demonstrated this quite clearly is from Salzberg et al. In 2002, in which they tasked elite, so expert and novice goalkeepers with trying to save penalty kicks. In the 1500 to 500 milliseconds pre-ball contact, so this is once the taker has marked out their run-up, they found that experts tended to fixate on the shoulders and the head, whereas novices fixated more on the torso and the trunk. As the kicker then approached the ball, you can see that novices tend to focus on similar sort of areas, whereas experts have now shifted their vision to more discriminating parts of the display in which they can begin to unpick and interpret information. These differences in visual search behaviour are also underpinned by differences in response accuracy. So the experts are able to save more penalties. So from this work, we can see that perceptual cognitive skills are important, but also the visual search that underpins those skills is expertise specific. Whilst pulling together this presentation, most of my work has been working with elite level adults. So have a look at the literature base around, well, are perceptual cognitive skills important in youth athletes? Can they be developed, etc.? There's a growing body of evidence that suggests that regardless of sport type, perceptual cognitive skills can discriminate between skilled and less skilled youth players, and they can also be accelerated across the learning process. So we know that perceptual cognitive skills are vitally important in the adult elite version of the game, but work's beginning to show that actually it can differentiate skillful youth players as well. So therefore, if we can identify ways in which to accelerate that learning process, then we can put our athletes in the best place to develop their potential. We also know that a lot goes on in a game or a competition. It's not an isolated event in which our participants aren't experiencing outside pressures. So we know that from a perceptual cognitive point of view, there are a range of factors that can impact the ability to anticipate action. So anxiety has been shown to negatively impact it, fatigue, lack of sleep, and altitude, amongst a range of other factors, have all been shown to lead to a decrement in perceptual cognitive skill. And interestingly, regardless of expertise, there is still that effect. So even elite level athletes suffer with these different stresses in their environment that negatively impacts their performance. There's a nice piece of work from Nieuwenhuis and Udejans a couple of years ago that tried to actually get to the root cause of this. So what is it that's actually causing these detrimental effects to occur? And due to the time constraints of the presentation, I won't go into lots of details on this work, but for me, these are the 4 key areas that came out of this work. So when feeling anxious or stressed or tired, players may look in the same places for information, but they may not be able to extract or process the information that they're looking at. They may be distracted and fixate on irrelevant cues. So whereas we spoke about before that elite athletes are able to identify the correct area to be focusing upon, when anxiety or low physical load is introduced, this may then interrupt this system and allow them to focus on irrelevant cues. Interestingly as well, when experiencing these stresses, work's shown that they actually have to recruit additional effort to maintain the same performance. So even though an athlete may be completing exactly the same task, when they are feeling levels of anxiety or fatigue, they have to recruit additional mental and physical effort to maintain performance. And some of that effort may actually lead not only to maintaining performance, but looking at trying to disrupt or stop the feeling of said stressor. So we know that perceptual cognitive skills are important. We know that they're negatively impacted by a range of stresses. So therefore, we need to work out, well, how can we put in place training interventions to allow our athletes to be robust and to stop these debilitating effects happening in the first place? And that's where some of our work in badminton comes in. So a funded project a few years ago from the Badminton World Federation, we wanted to examine, well, if we know players make poor decisions or poor anticipatory judgments when they're tired, what happens if we get to train them at those levels of tiredness or those levels of physical fatigue and then look to develop decision making? So in terms of a real brief outline of the study, in phase 1, when we put players in physically demanding situations, anticipatory skill decreased. So when they're tired, decision-making anticipation decreased. We then put them through a bit of a beasting. So weekly training sessions in which they were training at heart rate max of higher than 85% whilst completing some form of decision-making training. Once we've done that, we then put them back into the similar sort of thing from phase 1 to see, well, actually, can we transfer the training effects into a competition-like environment? And we could. So we found that by training with high levels of fatigue, that protected the decision-making processes from detrimental effects of physical load. So that's from a physical load point of view. The next piece of work that we completed was, what about from an anxiety point of view? So the example from Wimbledon a couple of days ago around anxiety overcoming an athlete so that they can't perform anymore. What happens if we get them training under an anxious state? Is there any transfer to performance? And again, a very similar layout to the study I just presented, in that in phase 1 of the study, we found that when players are anxious, so when we gave them a traditional anxiety-inducing type environment, there's a massive drop in anticipatory skill, and again, the mechanisms that underpinned it, such as visual search, changed. Players then went through a range of anxiety, what we call anxiety training methods, in which they look to develop decision-making whilst under those anxiety levels. And then again, as per the one I've just shared, we found that by doing this, it allowed them to be more robust and protect against the negative effects of anxiety. So we know that perceptual cognitive skills are important. We know that they can be impacted negatively as a result of various stresses within the environment. And these two pieces of work show that if you get your athletes or your participants to train under the sorts of load that they're going to feature or face in a game, then it will allow them to maintain performance when they feel in those similar situations further down the line. So in terms of real practical takeaway messages, for me, the first one would be get the load, or make sure the load mirrors the situation that the athletes are going to find themselves in. So although I've spoken about perceptual cognitive type interventions here, a real practical example from Leicester City from the year that they won the Premier League, they had a record low number of hamstring issues and injuries. When you consider the way in which Leicester City play in terms of their repeated sprints, their counter-attacking style, their high-intensity pressing type approach, this is sort of quite contradictory. But when you hear the head of sports science speak, and he talked through how at the end of training sessions, he used to get players to do repeated sprints so that the body became used to performing in the situation that they're going to find themselves in again. And for me, the work I've just presented mirrors this. So if our players are going to feel fatigued or anxious during a game, we need to make sure that they're feeling those same levels of stress in a training situation. On a related topic, I've not touched on it today, from a technical point of view, if our players' technique is breaking down near the end of the game because they're tired, maybe we need to think about, well, when am I doing my technical practices? More often than not, and from my context, technical practices tend to take place at the beginning of a session, when players are fresh, mentally and physically. When in fact, what would happen if we put the technical practice at the end of the session? What would happen to the technique when they're actually fatigued mentally and physically? So the first takeaway message would be make sure that the load that you put on them in training matches that of a game. And the second one would be, once we've got the environment around the load right, make sure that the practice that you get your performers to be completing encourages the behavior that you want to see. So from an invasion type game, this could be any game with a ball really. A real basic example of 3 players, player on the left passes to the player in the middle, player in the middle passes to the player on the right. Been done thousands of times. And how often do you hear coaches screaming, check your shoulder, scan, pictures, all the buzzwords that used to drive me crazy in academy football. But the players in these examples don't have to scan. They don't have to perceive any information because the practice isn't forcing them to. In no way are they rewarded for scanning or perceiving the environment. So therefore, a really simple, subtle change could be that before the ball's played into the centre man, the player on the far right-hand side can move to either the cone at the top or the cone at the bottom. Once he's done that, the player in the middle has to go to the opposite side. The ball then, the pattern is exactly the same, and the technical practice can continue. But by doing this sort of behaviour, this sort of approach, it's forcing your players, it's forcing the participants to adapt and use the perceptual cognitive skill that they've got, but it allows them to develop that in the future as well. So the 2 main takeaways from this presentation: make sure that the load matches the situation, whether that's mentally, whether that's physically. And then secondly, make sure that your practice really does encourage your participants to use the behaviour that you want them to use.